Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Federal agencies have more office space than they need, and under DOGE, they're accelerating plans to get rid of it. It might be easy to forget those efforts actually first got momentum under the Obama administration. It established policies to freeze and then reduce the so-called federal real estate footprint. It's one of the significant moments Federal News Network is looking back on as we mark our 25th anniversary. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman has more. And Jory, let's go back to those heady days of 2013 and the Obama administration. They really went after federal real estate, we sometimes forget.
Yeah, this has a long history, spans multiple administrations, but one key inflection point in all of this was in 2013 when the Office of Management and Budget under the Obama administration issued this memo freezing the federal real estate footprint, keep it from growing and sprawling in all these different directions. And then 2 years later, in 2015, it issued a reduce the footprint policy, an effort to get rid of excess and underutilized federal property. And this was the first time that OMB set a government-wide policy to use property that it owns as efficiently as possible, and for agencies to set annual reduction targets. By 2015, federal civilian agencies had more than 300,000 buildings, requiring $21 billion in annual operation and maintenance costs.
Yes, and so that's what led OMB to decide maybe we have more than we need?
Well, there was a long history leading up to this. Even before these two memos, there was a lot going on. One thing that really lit a fire under most agencies was in 2003, actually, when the Government Accountability Office added federal real property management to its high-risk list, and it remains there to this day. I spoke to Norman Dong, who was the PBS commissioner, the Public Building Service commissioner under the Obama administration, and he says that really was a pivotal moment.
They recognized how the federal real estate footprint was just continuing to grow. And something else they recognized was that the government doesn't even know how many owned and leased properties it has. So it just seemed to be out of control.
Yes, and the other point was the population of federal employees was not growing at that point, or only slightly. And so it seemed like, why more offices without more people? And as you mentioned, this goes back even maybe a decade before the Obama administration.
Yeah, even under the George Bush administration, there was the Federal Real Property Council, people from OMB and other agencies, people who are leading federal real property, just putting their heads together, making this an issue at the senior-most levels of these agencies. So there's just been so much momentum going on. I spoke to Bob Peck, he's another former PBS commissioner under the Obama administration. He says that this idea of underutilized real estate, this has been a long-standing problem. It was a problem when he joined government under the Clinton administration. Around then, he guesstimates that federal buildings on any given day were about 70% utilized.
Even then, we at GSA knew that there was more square footage per person in the GSA inventory than was warranted by the number of people we had. People don't necessarily get paid what they're worth, but one way you express your status is by the size of your office. People aspire over the course of their career to getting promoted, and one thing about being promoted is you get an office. Yes,
and you go from tile to carpet, area rug, and then you go to wall, and you've really made it. Maybe even a lamp and a sofa. And these policies, successive policies, now we've established it back to the Clinton administration, probably back to Truman you could find it. Did these policies have any effect on the real estate? Sounds like kind of not.
It did and it didn't. It definitely moved the ball in the right direction. One big thing that OMB under this guidance did is it and the General Services Administration set this limit of 136 square feet of office space per federal employee in these workspaces. And one thing Peck said that this did is it set a bar for where the utilization should be, but he said that some agencies were a little overly prescriptive with that, and it became a one-size-fits-all policy.
There's a number that we should just make everybody obey. And I said, well, it won't work for courthouses, won't work for laboratories. Some agencies, let's take law enforcement agencies, they don't spend much time in their office at all.
Besides, an average per person makes no sense, because if you are the director of the FBI and your office is several hundred square feet, that means somebody can't have 136, the minimum, or you're going to exceed the average. So it's kind of a nonsensical number, as I think Bob Peck pointed out. And now the Trump administration, what's the latest going on in excess real estate? Because this is something that's of many under the DOGE kind of firing plan here.
Yeah, this is a conversation that is still going on to this day. The Trump administration has really taken this idea of excess federal office space to a new level. Under the General Services Administration, they are looking to reduce federal building space that they own by about 50%. That's the goal that they're looking at, and they have been fast and furious with terminating leases and looking really closely at the portfolio of owned buildings. They recently had a list of 400 plus buildings, including some agency headquarters that they considered non-core assets. They eventually pulled that list because it was a little too aggressive, but they are going back with a 2.0 list, and they've started to build that back up incrementally.
And some agencies are actually going ahead and downsizing their office space. What are some of the current events here?
The latest one is the Environmental Protection Agency. They announced this week that they are moving out of the Ronald Reagan building, building that many agencies have office space in. This is not a huge impact for DC-based EPA employees. This impacts about 650 employees in all. The EPA's headquarters is just across the courtyard from the Reagan building, and that's a building that has thousands of EPA employees. So the plan here is that EPA is just really consolidating in its DC footprint, and in the process, it's going to save $18 million in lease space.
What about all of those office buildings that are in Roslyn, say, across the river from D.C.? There's many, many federal centers, if you will, that are outside of the core D.C. area. That's one of them, the Mark Center in Alexandria, that have a lot of people. Anything going on that we're aware of at those places?
Nothing specifically on those, but GSA leadership has made it very clear that of this 50% reduction they're looking to do, a considerable amount of that space is going to come from the greater D.C. metro area.
And GSA itself has kept shrinking its real estate footprint, too. They used to be 3 buildings downtown. They're down to 1, right?
That's how I understand it. There was a time not so long ago, a couple years ago, where there was a National Capital Region building that GSA held. They moved out of that building. They brought everyone to 1800 F Street. And in the latest update here, GSA is practicing what it's preaching here. It's going to move out of its headquarters and find space elsewhere. TBD on when that move is actually going to happen, but that's something that they have announced publicly.
Yeah, they used to have space in somewhere in the burbs in Virginia called Willow Run, and they had space on several floors of a big building in Roslyn. So, yeah, what goes around comes around. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman, thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom.
And be sure to see his and all of our stories on the 25th anniversary at federalnewsnetwork.com.